Hey everyone, JustJoosh here, and today I wanted to take some time to talk with you about one of my favorite, if not my favorite Marvel comics ever made. I've been reading Marvel comics for years at this point, and for some reason there is one story that has always been appealing to me and sticks out among the rest of Marvel's catalog, despite the fact that this story has rarely been adapted in media outside of the original comics. What story am I talking about, you may ask? Well, if you hadn't already guessed based on the title of this video, I am of course talking about Marvel's Secret War. Marvel's Secret War is a 5-issue miniseries. It was written by author Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Gabriele Dell'otto for Marvel Comics between 2004 and 2005. The series, while having similar names, should not be confused with Secret Wars, since that title is plural. It of course refers to an entirely different storyline. In fact, to be more specific, it could be 2 separate stories by Marvel that share the same name. One, Secret Wars, having come out in 1984, and the other being a sort of spiritual successor and sequel series to that original story that came out in 2015. Yes, this is very confusing, but, that's just the world of comic books, isn't it? Anyways, this miniseries, it's largely focused on Nick Fury and his response to finding out that the majority of the tech-based supervillains in the United States are being funded by a foreign power, and the consequences that Fury's actions have towards both the United States, but also towards the superheroes that he chooses to involve in this conflict. It is a super interesting storyline that I find is not brought up enough in terms of discussing some of what are the best Marvel comics of all time and that type of thing.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
So, naturally, I wanted to take some time today to help fill in some of those gaps and explain exactly why I enjoy this comic so much. So, as stated earlier, this comic was written by Brian Michael Bendis between 2004 and 2005. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Bendis, he's one of the most significant writers in the field of superhero comics. He has headlined some major stories for both Marvel and DC, but is more well known for his work with Marvel. Bendis is responsible for many of the company's most famous storylines and characters, being responsible for series like the original Ultimate Spider-Man, a phenomenal run on Daredevil, the New Avengers storyline, and the Secret Invasion crossover event. He's also responsible for the creation of the character of Jessica Jones entirely, and is responsible for many more great storylines and characters. So yeah, while today being predominantly a DC Comics author, Bendis was more or less running the ship with Marvel in terms of the early 2000s until around the early 2010s. His storylines had a lot of consequences for the Marvel Universe and are still remembered in the Marvel Universe today. However, I find that this comic often goes underappreciated in terms of Bendis' work, despite the idea behind it being so interesting. Bendis was inspired to write a story about the Marvel Universe through the lens of Nick Fury, taking on more of a spy thriller sort of vibe for how the Marvel Universe might operate kind of behind the scenes. Bendis was also apparently inspired to write this type of story because of conversations about classified operations he had as a kid with someone he knew who worked for US intelligence networks. Not very responsible for that person to be sharing information with a kid, but it did lead to a pretty cool Marvel story, so I guess that works out for us. Anyways, the basic premise of the book is that Nick Fury discovers that all tech-based supervillains are getting better gear from this character named the Tinkerer. The Tinkerer is a minor Spider-Man villain who has actually made appearances in Spider-Man Homecoming, as well as various other pieces of Spider-Man media, so you might be familiar with him. But he's basically this old engineer type guy who specializes in making this advanced equipment. Although after doing some more digging, it is actually discovered by the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Black Widow that the Tinkerer is being funded by foreign powers himself. In particular, he is being funded by a character named Lucia von Bardis, who, after the seeming death of Dr. Doom, became the ruler of Latveria, Dr. Doom's home country. Obviously, this information is pretty alarming, especially since Lucia von Bardis is still playing friendly with the United States, at least, in public on the surface. So, Nick Fury, after finding out this information, decides that he needs to take this info to the President of the United States. The President will of course be furious about Bardis' actions, especially since the United States have sent them tons of money in the form of aid after the country had Doom ousted from power. And here we sort of see the main conflict for the first part of this story forged. This is because the president, despite the fact that he should be upset and seek action against Bardis in some way, does nothing. Despite Fury stating that he has planned a counterattack, the president insists that he will handle the matter diplomatically, stating that he has strong relations with Bardis and basically believing that this doesn't need to be escalated in any sort of way, and he basically brushes Fury totally aside. Fury at this point is outraged. He doesn't believe that the president is taking the right course of action. This automatically stood out to me as a super unique premise since it mirrors what actually happened in the United States in around the same time. I imagine that this part of the story was likely inspired by the terrorist attacks carried out against the United States on September 11th, 2001, because at that time the United States didn't have strong security measures, and it led to this extremely tragic loss of life that would have been very fresh in Bendis' mind at the time of writing this story. So then, as is in the case with this story, the United States is leaving itself open for potential attack if they don't act and take this situation seriously.
And then, of course, the attacks happen. Plane 1 hits at 8:46, plane 2 at 9:03. You are a national security expert. What would you say was the biggest misunderstanding or lacking of intelligence on that day specifically?
Well, really, in the end, I have to blame the CIA director, George Tenet, because though he said after 9/11 how much he had tried to get the president's attention, et cetera, the reality was that the CIA failed in its fundamental mission, which is to protect the United States with warning and with intelligence. And so it's true that President Bush and his associates didn't really take terrorism seriously. But in the end, it is the responsibility of the CIA and other counterterrorism officials to make it clear to those who are in charge that this is, in fact, a real and pressing threat.
So, what does Fury decide to do after being told specifically to do nothing? Well, he decides to do something about it, of course. His solution is that he recruits a random assortment of Marvel heroes to form a team. Specifically, he recruits Spider-Man, Captain America, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Wolverine, Black Widow, and an entirely new original character named Daisy Jones, who is later codenamed to Quake. He assembles this ragtag group of heroes for one purpose: to secretly invade Latveria and overthrow the Lucia von Bardis regime. Now, this cast of heroes is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, I think that it's not exactly a coincidence that this story happens almost right after another story written by Bendis, that story of course being Avengers Disassembled. That event features the Avengers deciding to disband after the Scarlet Witch goes a little bit crazy and attacks the Avengers, killing several core members of the team. Of course, in the aftermath of this event, there is no longer an Avengers team for Nick Fury to call upon. Fury doesn't have a team that kind of exists on the world stage that can maybe meaningfully influence the United States to take action against Bardis, or maybe just take action against Bardis in and of themselves. But now, instead, he's left to his own devices to figure out how to solve this problem, hence his group of random characters. However, it is also very obvious to anyone who has read Bendis' other works that many of these characters are just like a collection of Bendis' favorites. In fact, about half of this team's roster would later be recycled for Bendis' New Avengers run, which starts shortly after this event. In many ways, this book kind of acts as a prelude or early predecessor to a lot of Bendis' New Avengers storylines, and many of his ideas and themes that Bendis would play around with later on can be seen here. It's interesting to see this story as a kind of nexus and branching off point for a lot of Bendis' later ideas and stories. Okay, so we got the basic premise of the book, but the next part of the story is a little bit complicated to explain since a lot of the plot is told through flashbacks. However, the main thing that we see next is Luke Cage getting attacked in his home by some unknown force. The results of this attack are devastating. Luke is left hospitalized, and his girlfriend, Jessica Jones, isn't left in a great state either. Jessica is understandably seething with rage after these events, desperate to understand what is going on and why they were attacked. Now we see re-enter into this story Nick Fury. Nick Fury, he shows up to the hospital where Luke is being treated at, and it is clear that Fury has some understanding of what is going on and feels implicated in this attack to some degree. Jessica is sort of able to pick up on this guilt by Fury, but we only really truly find out what happened and why Luke was attacked through flashbacks when Nick Fury assembled that previously mentioned ragtag team of heroes. So, now we come back to when the team was first assembled. With Fury's team now in place, the small collection of characters are snuck into Latveria and given special secret costumes and are tasked with the destruction of the Latverian government. They are at first told that they are just going to go after Von Bardas. However, Fury ends up going a lot farther than just, that simple solution. What ends up happening is that the characters blow up the government building of Latveria, including Von Bardas, basically unwittingly involving all of these heroes in this mass killing event where they eliminate the entirety of the Latverian government. This naturally doesn't sit very well with many of these heroes, many of which have a no-kill rule like Spider-Man for example. So to prevent these heroes from having to deal with the mental guilt of being involved in this attack, Nick Fury makes the decision to wipe all memory of the event from the minds of the characters, thinking that the good guys won and that they would never have to deal with the consequences of this attack again. Of course, things are revealed to not be quite that simple. I won't reveal exactly what happens to the characters later on down the line because I really do think that this story is interesting and that you should find out for yourselves by reading it. However, I do want to talk about some elements of the ending of the book just a bit, so there are some vague spoilers for the ending ahead. Mainly, I just want to talk about the elements that sort of have consequences for the Marvel Universe later down the line. Because one thing that I really liked about this sort of event era of the Marvel Comics during the early 2000s was the sense of consequences that all these events had. Avengers Disassembled, for example, leads to the dissolution of the Avengers, Civil War effectively splits the Marvel Universe in two, and so on. This story is, of course, no different. The main consequence of this story is that Nick Fury steps down as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and goes into hiding. He recognizes that he will face legal consequences if he sticks around, so he goes underground to continue to monitor things from afar. This abdication leads to Maria Hill becoming director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and having a pretty strong anti-superhero approach to running that organization. This sets up a lot of future story elements that are revisited in future Marvel events, particularly in Civil War, where Maria Hill is kind of one of the main antagonists of the story, especially at the start, along with Secret Invasion, where the whole world of the Marvel Universe gets torn upside down because Skrulls are revealed to have infiltrated so many teams and organizations in the Marvel Universe. The only character who actually is safe from all of this is Nick Fury, since he is no longer involved in any of the legitimate superhero teams in the United States. Because he's totally separate and can't trust anybody, this leads to Fury and a new team of assembled heroes that he makes having a pretty big role in the Secret Invasion event. So yeah, this event, while only being a miniseries, doesn't just stand on its own, but also does have a lot of lasting consequences for the Marvel canon. Fitting for an event where such extreme actions are taken. Another thing that I haven't really praised about the book up until this point would be the artwork. Gabriele Dell'otto's work is really incredible. I mean, I've been showing it throughout this video. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to sort of recognize that yourself. I think a lot of the time it does speak for itself. I think that the more dramatic and realistic artwork definitely fits the tone of the book really well. The story does take itself quite seriously and tries to ground superheroes in the politics of the real world, and I think it does so quite well. This serious tone is heavily supported by Dell'otto's artwork, and on a real quick side note, I just want to say that I love the design of the costumes used in the Secret War. I really wish that we got a chance to see a lot of these costumes again sometime in the future. At this point, I do sadly think that that ship has pretty much sailed and these costumes are probably not going to be used again, but I would love to see them appear in the comics in the future. Spider-Man's design is particularly good and was thankfully included in the new Spider-Man games on PlayStation as an alternate costume, so hey, at least it was used for something, right? Now, I don't think that this story is perfect or anything, but I really think that the main thing that holds this book back is time. This is only a 5-issue miniseries, which, while making this book very easy to read from start to finish, does leave the event feeling a bit lacking in comparison to other Marvel events that feature more issues along with multiple tie-in comics. There are a select few tie-in comics to this storyline, but it's not given the same amount of attention in comparison to other books like Civil War or Secret Invasion. Marvel at this point hadn't really gone full out with their events in that same sort of style quite yet, so it does make sense as to why that is not the case, but I do think it was something of a missed opportunity because I think that this event had the makings of something even bigger and more interesting than what it had turned out to be. In other words, this book was so good, I really just wanted more of it. So yeah, that's really a very brief overview of this book and why I think it is so cool. If you have read the story, please let me know your personal thoughts on it. I would love to hear what you have to say. If you have not read the book, I would super recommend that you do so. Also, many of the ideas from this story were later incorporated into Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 2, so if you have that game, you can also experience the events of this story in a vague sort of way. Anyways, that's all I have to say today. Thank you all very much for watching. Until next time, I'm JustJoosh, and that's just my opinion.